Hello everybody and welcome to week 10. Welcome back also from March break. If you were in a context where you actually had a March break and were able to travel somewhere or spend time with friends and family, I hope everybody has had a nice week off and has come back rested and rejuvenated. So what I wanted to talk about is sort of wrap up a little bit from the peer feedback unit and talk a little bit about assignment number 2, which is due on Friday, and then to kind of introduce the material for this next week, which is around accuracy in writing. So from our peer feedback unit, talking a little bit about what is peer feedback, should we do it, should we not do it, things like this. Everybody seemed to have a different position on it, and it seems really to reflect what a lot of scholars and teachers the world over feel about peer feedback. Some people like it, some people don't like it, some people wish they could like it, some people feel a little bit ambivalent about it, maybe not finding that it's the best use of class time and students aren't really learning what they should be learning. So I certainly sympathize with all of those points, and I certainly have felt that way at various times in various classes in my own writing career working with peer feedback. I think what I wanted to say is that peer feedback is one of those things. I think one thing we can take away is that it needs to be planned very carefully, and as a teacher you really need to buy into it yourself. I mean, do you really believe in this? Do you think it's going to be useful? Do you think it's going to be helpful? Because if you don't believe that, then it's probably not going to work out very well, because you've got to get the students to buy into it, if you will. And also, and this is something that I've had to learn for myself, is sort of keeping my expectations in check. You know, how much improvement, how much development am I going to see through these drafts? And I've used certainly peer feedback guidelines and sheets that have been very useful. But in my experience in teaching, getting feedback from students on what they liked and didn't like about peer feedback, and of doing lots and lots of teacher observation, what I've come away with is really spending a lot of time at the beginning scaffolding all of this. So getting the students to talk about, you know, how they might benefit, eliciting from them, if you will, how they might benefit from peer feedback, and getting them to generate a list of criteria in what they want to be, what they want others to look for in their writing. And I think there was some commentary this past week, you know, where I think it was Priya talking about, you know, she has her students generate, or maybe it was Allison, I'm sorry, I forget which person said they actually do this in their class, which I think is great and very useful, very helpful. I would also recommend, and this is some things I've seen and now that I do in my own teaching, is to do a little bit of modeling, and I think many of you do this as well, where you give students samples to look at and you go over the text together and you teach them a little bit about, you know, how to approach a paper, how to respond. I think that's exactly what you need to do, and if you're doing that, fantastic. But also spending some time looking at the language around feedback. What comments get the type of revision? And Goldstein and or Conrad and Goldstein talked a little about this in their case study. You know, what kinds of feedback were the students able to access and develop and improve, and what kinds of feedback were not very useful in doing that. So brainstorming, writing up on the board vocabulary or phrases that will generate better feedback and which won't. And I think we saw, for example, in the teacher feedback on the sample about 2 or 3 weeks back from that one professor, you know, the type of feedback that is rather useless and in fact rather damaging. The last component to peer feedback I might add is actually modeling it. So John Hedgecock actually is, from our Ferris and Hedgecock book, is a former professor of mine, and I had an opportunity in the mid-90s actually to observe him teach a whole composition course once, a semester long, and I learned a lot from him. And some of the techniques he did, which I thought were very useful, were to actually sort of model, role play, if you will, a mock feedback session, which really gave the students a context. Okay, well, how am I supposed to do this? You know, even like, where do you position your body when you're giving feedback to another student? And what things should you go over? And, you know, what language do you use to deliver this information? And then, you know, inviting the students to observe that skit, if you will, that role-playing session, and then ask them to add other things that they might like to know or to say. And then that allows the person who's listening to think about, okay, how do I want to respond to this? What other questions would I like to know? One last point in all of that is something that I have learned along the way that actually worked quite well. It may work for your classrooms, it may not. But one thing that I thought was very effective was having students work in maybe groups of 3 and sometimes 4, and I'm also participating in that group to kind of help scaffold the feedback in a particular meaningful and focused way. So for example, imagine that there are 4 of us in a group, and each of us reads the other's paper, makes comments. Then in that group, I would ask one of the students to, start with one student, and the rest of us would sit in the group and talk about the paper in front of the student. And it gave that student an opportunity of what it must be like to be the proverbial fly on the wall, if you will, to listen to what other people say about their writing. And during this time, they can't speak. They're not allowed to speak to the group, and the group can't speak to them. So what this kind of creates is the student really has to listen very carefully as to what's being said, take notes, and then at the end, we invite that student in to clarify, make comments, share concerns, so on and so forth. And I found that to be very, very helpful because 1, certainly students get an opportunity to practice listening skills. 2, it really gives them the sense of how other people may see their writing and what they are struggling with. And students aren't always, when they send their writing out to the professor, there to explain, justify, confusions that the professor might have. So it raises their awareness to what the problems might be in their writing, and then gives them the opportunity to respond in the end. So that worked out really, really well for me, and I hope it works out well for you if you choose to do that. There's a book on peer response that I wanted to share with everybody. That's by Lou and Hansen. You've probably seen this book. This is actually a really, really good book that goes into the history behind peer feedback, its notion drawing out of the process writing approach and sociocultural theory with Vygotsky and the reasons in terms of building the ZPD and scaffolding, so on and so forth. So it starts out with a theoretical framework and then goes into addressing concerns and modeling different ways to do it with suggested activities. So it's an easy read, very, very interesting. And then one I forgot to share last week was a book by Lynn Goldstein, who actually was a former teacher of mine and a colleague who I'm going to be co-publishing an article with soon. And her book is on teacher-written commentary in second language writing classrooms. And this book is also quite interesting and very useful, and it's sort of a complement to work that Dana Ferris does. And this is the other one. This is kind of for this week. This is error treatment in second language writing. So Dana Ferris certainly looks at a lot of the more discrete ways in which you can start looking at writing or sentence level writing, where Lynn sort of looks at more qualitative setting up context for writing and ways in which to provide feedback. So, but together they complement each other quite well. So, moving right along to keep within the time frame, I've had an opportunity to look at assignment number 2, the feedback that you're giving each other. It looks really, really good. The assignments themselves, what you've been doing in terms of how you're giving feedback to the student, your own reflections on it, drawing it on the literature to kind of take a position, and how you would explain your approach looks great. I would make one maybe cautionary note, not to go overboard so much on a lot of feedback. So keep in mind that there's 2 parts of this. If you look at any piece of writing, there's developing the content and the ideas, and then there's the sentence level, the grammatical aspect of it. So keep in mind, if you start out doing a lot of grammatical error correction, and the student revises and it's this perfectly grammatical piece, but yet the content is still missing, then the student is going to have to go back and revise all over again, and all of the work that you've put into doing error correction may have not been the best time spent. So keep in mind how you prioritize and what you'd ask the student to do first. So that's a little bit of a hint, and something to think about and reflect on as you're writing. reflecting on it. But overall, they're looking quite good, and I certainly appreciate all of the time that you've put into it. I think you're all very masters at giving good feedback, and I certainly am very encouraged and very excited to see what I've seen so far. Last but not least, and in the few remaining minutes, this week's work is an article by Dana Ferris, which is the case of grammar correction in second language writing class, and then also Truscott's very famous article and the debate between those two. Also the chapter in Ferris and Hedgecock where they kind of lay out the whole plan behind the history behind error correction and accuracy. They also provide some wonderful and very helpful logs. Peter talked about that in his summary from this past week. That, you know, and I know that a lot of these logs John Hedgecock has developed because I saw him as he developed them, and they're quite useful for scaffolding the student and giving them some sense of how actually to approach errors. So error correction is a huge part of the field, and you know, what is an error? When do you correct? How do you correct? How does the whole idea around focus on form and raising awareness, especially in a writing classroom context, how is that all taken up? And combining that with issues that come out of composition theory, which is the content of the piece. And, you know, how do we focus on the content, develop the content and the ideas, while at the same time talking about the language. So I'm out of time, but again, I'm so glad that we're back from break. I'm looking forward to reading your work at the end of the week and catching up with everybody online. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.